everyone. Welcome back to the podcast Everyday Anarchism. I am your host, Graham Culbertson, and my guest today, who I'm speaking to in person, which is very rare, is Lyndal Roper, and I'm gonna pick up the book to make sure I get the title right. We're talking about Lyndal's book, Summer of Fire and Blood, The German Peasants' War. All right, Lyndal, can you just start by introducing yourself?
Thank you so much, Graham, and thanks for coming over and being in Oxford. Yes. I know you didn't come all the way to Oxford just to do this, but thanks anyway. So my name's Lyndal Roper, and I'm a historian. I've worked on German history, early modern German history. I've done a biography of Luther. Most people don't write a biography of Luther having worked on witchcraft, but hey, that's what I did. So I work at the University of Oxford. I'm Regius Professor of History, which is a sort of scary title. It just means that I'm appointed by the monarch. But it means it's a chair that was established in the 18th century, so it's fun to have it.
Well, congratulations. There's not a physical chair, is there? Or is there a chair somewhere?
No.
Yeah, this is an old joke, but nevertheless. Can you start? So I guess let me say a bit for the listeners and also for you, my interest in this. And anyone who's been listening to this podcast all along, which is we're coming up in 4 years, this isn't going to surprise them, but the way this fits into this narrative that I'm pursuing in terms of anarchism is anarchism is really supposed to have originated, according to Kropotkin, in the late 18th, early 19th century, when the amalgam of new philosophy, especially Rousseau, and then the new ways of being in the world from the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, have created this new milieu, and then one of the many reactions, this revolutionary reactions to it, is called anarchism. I myself am a big fan of Gerard Winstanley and of John Milton, and have worked very hard over years to push this horizon back and find most of the same set of concerns that we find with the Romantics and the French Revolution with what we might call proto-Romantic Puritans and the English Revolution. And in my conversations about this with Nigel Smith, he has always mentioned the Anabaptists and pushing further back and going into Germany in the 16th century, which is something that I have not had the expertise to do. And so lo and behold, I find this book, which does indeed end one of the consequences of the German Peasants' War you mentioned is, sort of the birth of Anabaptism. And so I'm tracing this revolutionary thing, which I'm happy to call anarchism, but we don't have to call it anarchism, right? But this revolutionary set of ideas all the way back from 1789 into England in the 1640s and now back into what we call Germany, but was not Germany then in the early 16th century. So there we are. Anything you would like to say in response to that is fine, and then we can get to this German Peasants' War.
Welcome to the 16th century. You should have come here in the first place.
You've got to understand, my specialty is 19th century American, so that just simply going back to the 17th century was scary for me, and I needed a lot of guidance.
Yes, I think the 16th century is just really interesting to go back to, because it's a very different world, and it's before we've got the expansion of Europe abroad. It's before we've got industrialization. It's a very different way of thinking about the environment, and that's why I really wanted to go back. So we're now in 2025, and it's 500 years since the Peasants' War, and I've had the most amazing year. Because in Germany, it is a massive event and everywhere is celebrating it. So I can't tell you how many teeny tiny places I've been to and the amazing experiences I've had. I mean, just to give you an example, I ended up on Midsummer Night's Eve on a battlefield in Frankenhausen, which is a tiny little place in the former East Germany, sitting underneath a huge panorama monument to the Peasants' War. and having a banquet with white tablecloths, gold cutlery, gold plates, all organised by an artist. The most weird experience, and it's been thing after thing like that. Just an amazing set of events, because people really want to understand the Peasants' War, and it's high time we did. And the reason why everybody wants to understand it is because it's one of the big differences between the former West Germany and the former East Germany, which was communist. And they had opposite ways of thinking about the Reformation and about the Peasants' War. And now it's really time to bring those two ways of thinking about it together. And that's why I'm just so loving going around to all these places.
Okay, so I have a dozen questions to ask, and I'm going to try and tamp down my anarchic impulse to jump around. And before we go any further, can you just tell us what the German Peasants' War was? Because I'm sure many people listening to this podcast right now will have vaguely heard of it, or possibly never. I mean, they may have some sense that there were peasant revolts. There's some peasant revolts in history, and they tend to get kind of skipped over. So tell us about this one.
Well, this one is a biggie. It's probably the biggest uprising, the biggest peasant uprising in Western Europe before the French Revolution. It's really extraordinary. And it is terrible that people have forgotten about it. It starts right down in southern Germany in mid to late 1524. And it's down near the border of Switzerland. And it seems to be connected with some religious ideas. There's a guy there, Balthasar Hubmeier, who does his own little reformation in Waldshut. And then gradually it starts with a series of local peasant revolts, people taking on their own local lord. And then it sort of, towards the end of 1524, dies down a bit. But then, over the winter, 1524 to 5, when people are indoors and when they've got time to talk and exchange ideas, then it starts to get going, and then it explodes in late February, early March, 1525. And what happens then is that instead of it all being about you and your local landlord, it becomes much wider, and it's seen as a set of issues that are to do with the Reformation, with godly law, divine justice, and it's a whole understanding of Christ's role. So how it works is it's all about freedom. And after all, it's Martin Luther who'd written a tract called The Freedom of a Christian. And that's a really incendiary word to use. You can't go about just talking about freedom in this period without people immediately thinking, this refers to serfdom. And in the southern area of Germany, many, many people were owned as serfs. And that's the issue that is suddenly connected with religion. Because, as Luther says, the Christian is free, the Christian is servant of all, but also Lord of all. And that's connected with a whole series of ideas about the Eucharist. Because what bought our freedom? Well, it was Christ's precious blood. And what are you not allowed to have in communion? The wine. So it couldn't have been, that connection is absolutely explosive. So those ideas start to really develop, and then around a little town called Memmingen, people began to put their grievances together. And we think we'll never know how many, but we know that there are at least 300 or so of these. And then in this town of Memmingen, a lay sort of pro-Reformation pamphlet writer called Sebastian Lotzer read through all of these and created out of them a set of 12 articles. And the set of 12 articles is really an extraordinary achievement, because he really does get everything that's raised in what's left of the 300 that I've read. there's not much that he misses out. And he systematizes it, he makes it clear, and then they have a program. And what's changed? Print. You can now print the 12 articles, and we know that something like 25,000 copies of the 12 articles were printed. So what happens is a huge explosion, and a lot of it started in the little shopkeepers guild room. I've just come back from there, going in there to actually be in the room. There's not much left of the room, but you can see it's got 7 huge windows. So it was very open to the outside, even though it's up on the first floor. So Sebastian Lotzer does the 12 articles, and it all starts to take off from there. And the reason why it's so important and so massive is that it spreads from the south, then right through all of southern Germany, then through Franconia, Swabia, right up through Thuringia in the former East Germany, Saxony, right round towards Austria and down into Italy. So it is, in terms of area, absolutely vast. And then the number of people who died in the course of it is colossal. And once you know that, you can never feel the same way about the Reformation again. So we'll never know exactly how many, but it would be somewhere between 70 and 100,000. Now that's 1% of the male population. And if you compare that with the First World War in the UK, there it's 2% of the population, but that's over a period of 4 years. This is that scale of bloodshed within a period of about 2 to 3 months. So it really is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, that's astonishing. And I mean, when you put those numbers, I mean, I appreciate the comparison to World War I. I've just been teaching my students about the Great War because the class I'm teaching right now is about, among other things, Tolkien's experience with the Great War and the way that influenced his creation of the world, and they just need to understand that it's a war in which young men were lost at rates, unheard of. But you're telling me that it's a similar loss of life.
Absolutely. So if you think about the Reformation, what is terrible is that people so often write about the Reformation as though the Peasants' War is something completely different. But it's not. And just as you've pointed out with the First World War, you can't understand the literature unless you're aware of the trauma that's left when that number of young men in a generation are killed. With the Peasants' War, it's people of all ages. It's not just young men, but it is a massive loss of life in a very short space of time. And I think that leaves a trauma. And then you need to think about the Reformation in a different way as a response, as it starts to institutionalize itself, as a response to that scale of loss of life and disenchantment on the part of the peasants.
Yeah, so this brings me to something that's very important, at least for the narrative I'm following. So when I talked through the English Revolution with John Morrill, he was pretty resistant to the idea that it's a modern revolution, in part because of the role that religion played. And I'm going to misquote him, but he said roughly something like, you need to have gone through the Enlightenment in order to have a modern revolution. My contention is that Protestantism and the Reformation is merely the Enlightenment, but put in religious terms. What the light of the Holy Spirit fills the role of whatever it is that Voltaire is going to praise, the light of reason or Kantian logic or something like that. And this is where I wanted to go next, right? Because in your narrative, which I'm totally convinced by, the Reformation is not a religious thing. It is a religico-political thing. The two are intimately bound together, but also, if I understand correctly, Luther himself wants to keep them relatively separate. So can you maybe make sense of that for us?
Well, I think the role that Luther plays in all of this is very difficult, shall we say. So when you look at what the peasants say, and what they want. Those are all the things that Luther had also demanded. So the peasants want, and they usually, article number 1 is, and in the 12 articles, it's article number 1, they want the right to call their own preacher, to hire and to fire him if he's not preaching the pure word of God. On the face of it, that doesn't look very revolutionary, but in fact it is a massive attack on the propertied church, because the person who had the right to appoint the local priest or preacher was whoever owned the tithe. And that could be not someone local at all. It could be a monastery or a convent, or it could be a nobleman who just happened to have that right. So in saying we want the right to appoint our own preacher, they're taking that whole area of religion into their own hands, and they're insisting that they want to hear the word of God as it is in the Bible, with no additions, as they always add. So that is a really revolutionary demand. And I think it's really important not always to think in terms of the Enlightenment as though that's where everything begins. I think in some ways, what's happened over my generation is that people have realised that the environment is really important, and that we need to think about ownership and control of resources like the water, like the air, like wood. We need to think about those as being really important issues, not just things that only peasants are concerned about, because we can see that this is something that's concerning them. So how they see it is the big thing that is part of peasant theology is creation. The idea that God created the world, he created the air, the waters, the fish that swim in the water, the birds in the air. And so they should be shared equally, and no individual should be able to monopolise them. And I think that's a really important and revolutionary idea. And it's really important to go back before the Enlightenment, because then you can unthink a lot of ideas that we have about property and about resources. And we can go back to a time when what property was slightly different and is much more to do with the right to use something. And we can go back to a time before industrialisation and a time before, just when it was beginning, monopoly capital. And you can see monopoly capital starting with the Fuggers, who are the richest family in the world at this point. They're just getting going in the 1520s. But we haven't got a world yet where there are monopoly capitalism in the way that we would see later. So I think it's really exciting as a period.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, I don't know if this sounds right to you, but what you're describing and what Winstanley talks about seem to me like almost completely in union. You know, the earth is a common treasury held by all, and in the 17th century, as you know, enclosure is happening as after Henry VIII has smashed the monasteries, and over the past century or so, the seeds of bourgeois capitalism are growing. Winstanley seems really out of time when he says, couldn't just anyone grow the food they need on land that's not being used? But he claims that he's just asking for what peasants have always had. And so it seems like this is again another moment 100 years earlier in Germany where this right to live the communal village life is being threatened by whatever we would call it, progress, capitalism, that sort of thing.
Well, it's a little bit different from Winstanley, and one of the ways in which it's different is that the idea of freedom is collective. It's not individual freedom. And that's where it's very different from the mainstream, if you like, of the English Revolution, where it's the independent individual, the person who's not owned by somebody else, and therefore who can have an independent opinion and who's part of a public sphere. That is absolutely not what the German peasants are talking about. They're talking about the freedom to be able to enjoy creation, and they're talking about something that's collective. They're not talking about individual rights at all. So it's kind of strange, because in Memmingen, you will find today people will celebrate the Peasants' War as the birth of human rights and the birth of the individual. Well, that's not what the Peasants' War was. And it's even more exciting, I think, than the idea of the birth of the rights of the individual, because it makes us think about freedom in a wider way, and I think that's really good. The other way in which I think things are very different is that whereas Winstanley and the Diggers were a minority movement, and they're very literary, the German Peasants' War is an absolutely mass movement. We'll never know how many people took part, but it will be in the hundreds of thousands. And one of the things that they do is they set out to destroy convents and monasteries, and they attack many of them. So we tried to calculate how many they did attack, and so we have a project in which we first of all try to establish what all the convents and monasteries in the area of the Peasants' War were. And then we worked out every instance that we could see where the monastery or convent was attacked in some way. And that can include even having an inventory taken, because if someone takes an inventory of your monastery, they find out how rich you are. So monasteries and convents resisted having inventories taken because that showed any local authorities just what you could gain by secularising. So we found out that of 1,269 convents and monasteries, over 600 were attacked. So it's about half of all the convents and monasteries in the area, and that is quite extraordinary. And what that shows is that there is a deep vein of anti-monasticism which comes out in the Peasants' War, and that's for a number of reasons. Again, who started all this? Well, it was Martin Luther, who questioned the value of monasticism. But what happens when they're attacked is that two things are coming together, because some of the worst landlords were in fact the monasteries and convents. They were the ones who insisted on serfdom, on physical serfdom, and on owning people. They were the ones who curtailed whom you could marry. So it's a very interesting conjunction, exactly as you said, of social and political with religious in a way that they're completely indistinguishable.
Okay, so this thinking about monasteries, thinking about monasteries and convents, I mean, it brings to mind, one of my favorites, William Morris. And Morris describes, cathedrals as something that's written, like the love and dedication of the people for the land on the landscape. And I think there's probably some truth to that, although, modern scholars tend to, I think read cathedrals more as monuments to coercion and elite empowerment. In your book, in addition to monasteries and convents, it's the castle, which is sort of the secular version of the cathedral, which is so clearly, whatever we might think about cathedrals, castles are not the expression of the community's love for the land. I think you say they've written lordship on the landscape, something like that. And I was just so struck by this idea. It seems almost like atavistic or primal, that if a peasant sees a castle, that peasant thinks that should come down. They know what a castle is, and they know that it should come down. So can you tell us about the castles and the wars on the castles?
Well, very often they were the ones who were forced to build the darn things. We're now starting a second phase of our project where we're actually going to count how many castles were attacked, and this is going to be much more difficult. It's also clear that it's much more worthwhile to attack a convent or monastery than it is to attack a castle, because convents and monasteries have huge food stores, and they also have a lot of money. So that's why they are attacked. And one of the ways that the peasants were able to keep going for so long was because they were able to supply themselves by taking stuff from monasteries and convents, drinking all their beer, drinking their wine, going into those stores and getting all those cheeses and hams and taking them with them, and taking the animals as well. They seem to have, very often they were given oxen by monasteries who were desperate to say, go away, and they give them an ox to kill and barbecue, which they do. So they play a very, very important role. And the castles, a lot of them seem to have been falling down, I would say. There's one extraordinary one at Weinsberg, where, I mean, I don't know whether you've ever been in a German castle, but they're quite...
I guess I haven't. I've only been to Berlin. There's not...
Oh, right, no. So the thing about a castle is it's a jolly inconvenient place to live. They're cold, they're drafty, they're really not a lot of fun. So a lot of these castles are run with a skeleton staff, and sometimes there'll be a local bureaucrat who'll be in touch with the town nearby or whatever. And so in the case of Weingarten, all the soldiers who were meant to be guarding the place were actually down in town having a good time. So getting the castle doesn't always get you that much, but it's a way of attacking lordship. And of course, some of the castles were actually owned by convents and monasteries or by bishops, prince bishops. There's one which they managed to take, which is where they get a huge store of money, which was kept there.
So let's maybe go back to the narrative as I'm jumping around with all these questions. So first, I think we need to introduce this other figure. Is it Munzer or Munzer?
Thomas Munzer.
Munzer.
Yes.
So it seems like there's a maybe overly schematic, but I'll start with this idea that Munzer is the opposite of Luther, and that he wants to make political radicalism and religious radicalism the same. But you can take it away and tell us who he is and what his role is in this.
The devil who rules in Multhausen, as Martin Luther called him. He is a really fascinating figure. And that's also how you understand Thomas Munzer is one of the major issues at the moment. And if I can just do an aside, I've been absolutely fascinated about this because in the communist East Germany, he became the absolute hero of the Reformation. So instead of celebrating Martin Luther to begin with, they celebrated Thomas Munzer as a revolutionary figure. And he is the main guy in Friedrich Engels's, Marx's co-workers' history of the peasant war. He really plays a very powerful role in that as a kind of revolutionary leader who's out of time, who's in advance of the peasants who he's leading, which I always feel is a really bad way to think about people. No one can be ahead of everybody else.
I could not agree with you more, but I'm afraid, boy, does that stick in the language. Everyone is before their time. Every artist is before their time. They're not. Everyone is in the time they are in, and that is all there is to it, I'm afraid. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so Thomas Munzer, he was on the 5-mark note in East Germany, and the biggest investment that the regime made in its, what you might call its propaganda, was when it built the Panorama, the biggest painting in the world, 14 metres high, 123 metres long. And to do it, they levelled the top of the battlefield in Frankenhausen to build this gigantic thing. And when did it open? I mean, you couldn't make it up. It opened in September 1989, just weeks before the whole regime fell. So it is an extraordinary picture. It is a great work of art, and if ever you're in East Germany, you really should go and see it. It is just extraordinary, and everyone I've ever been there with has just been overwhelmed by it, because it is just so massive and so full of detail, and it just really brings the 16th century to life. And it's by the artist Werner Tübke, who was valued not just in the East but also in the West and recognised. And in the West, his works were bought for the West German gallery as well as in the East. So Thomas Münzer, this big figure, this big revolutionary hero, now of course people don't know what to do. How do you come to terms with him when you've grown up with him as the chief actor in the Peasants' War and you've grown up in communist East Germany? And if you're in the West and you've idealised him as the sort of revolutionary figure, the anarchist precursor, if you like,
Right.
how do you now deal with him in this new Germany that we're now in? So that's what's been fascinating me. And what I've found absolutely extraordinary is that no one is talking about Thomas Münzer at the moment. I haven't been to a single academic paper that deals with him. And even in Mühlhausen itself, where Thomas Münzer was, this year they've put up a new memorial, but it's not to Thomas Münzer. It's a model of the artist Albrecht Dürer's Peasant Pillar, which is a sketch memorial that Dürer made to the Peasants' War. So, all this fuss about Münzer, why? Well, he is a fascinating figure, and he is the most prominent and important theologian of the German Peasants' War. He starts out, he's one of those people that has a series of short-term jobs, has difficulty getting a permanent place somewhere, finally ends up in Allstedt, where, what would you expect a revolutionary to do when they arrive in somewhere like Allstedt and finally they can put their theology into life? What would you expect somebody to do? Well, what he does is he translates the Mass into German and he sets about doing the music, and he prints the music and the whole German Mass, and just basically uses all the printing presses in the town to do this monumental thing. It's about the last thing you would expect. But that's one of the ways in which I think people have misunderstood Münzer, because he's a mystic and music is really, really important to him. So he continues on in Allstedt, and one of the other things he does that's really interesting is he interprets people's dreams. And they come to him to ask him what their dreams mean, and he sees dreams as God talking to us directly now. So in addition to the Bible, which is Luther's thing, only the Bible is important, for Thomas Münzer, the Bible is what he calls a dead letter unless God speaks to us now. And one of the ways he does that is through people's dreams. And he has one old man and basically an amanuensis who writes down his dreams. And this old man provides material for many of Münzer's sermons. So if you think about that, I think it's really fascinating to think about a revolutionary who is got real pastoral gifts and who's also using all that power of the unconscious as well as the conscious. And I think the dreams and having a sense of how the future could be different, I think that's really important to the Peasants' War.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck again. This question of what do you do if it's just the Bible? I mean, it seems to me that Münzer has it right and Luther has it wrong, because the problem is the Holy Spirit, right? So the problem is if you're only allowed to read the Bible and do what it says, exactly what the Bible says, not what Augustine has written or not what the church fathers say, well, the problem is people disagree on what the Bible means, not what it says, but what it means. And therefore, this is where we get the tradition that flowers into something like transcendentalism in the 19th century, but it also goes right to people like John Edwards. Well, the only thing you have besides the text itself is that thing in your heart that's telling you how to read the text. And secularly, we might call it the unconscious or our desires or something, but at least in the traditions that I know, they don't call it that. They call it the Holy Spirit. And it seems to me that Luther just wants to reinscribe church fathers. He wants to be the church father, and Calvin as well. And that strikes me as an incomplete theological overturning of these structures. Does that make sense?
It just shows you're not a Lutheran. No, Luther is great. He says, and he wasn't entirely joking, he says, I pray to God not to send me dreams. He knows how dangerous they are. Melanchthon, his co-worker, his loyal co-worker, took a very different view about dreams. But for Luther, dreams are dangerous. It's not that he doesn't have dreams, he does, and they're always really interesting, the ones that we know about. But that's another whole subject, dreams and the Reformation. Luther thinks, of course, that he has the correct interpretation of Scripture.
He does.
And so he writes prefaces to every book of the Bible, explaining how it should be understood. And that's why he wants to establish a university and why he wants to train all those who are going to be pastors. And that leads to one of the early splits in the Reformation between him and Andreas Karlstadt, who's the forgotten reformer of the Reformation, but who's a really interesting guy, some of whose ideas prefigure the things that Calvin was later to argue. And Karlstadt thinks that ordinary people should interpret the Bible for themselves, much to Luther's absolute scorn and disgust.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, maybe I can mention I was raised Calvinist. I'm not Calvinist anymore, but I took Calvinism in, from the age of 5 or so. I guess let's finish the revolution and kill all these revolutionaries now before I don't want to do it either. But how does this end?
Well, to go back to Münster, after he gets pushed out of Auerstedt, he goes to the imperial city of Mühlhausen. And that's a much bigger canvas for him to work on. It's an independent town, is quite rich. And there, what you have is radicalization that happens very fast, a complete overturning of the town council, the creation of an eternal council. Münster is forced out and then comes back in. And by February 1525, just as the whole Peasants' War is about to kick off, he's back in Mühlhausen, having been to the Hegau and some bits of southern Germany and to Nuremberg, having been to the areas which had been involved in revolt in 1524 and were experiencing unrest in early 1525. We'll never know whether that really had an impact on what happened in the Peasants' War, but it clearly had an impact on him. So he gets more and more radical. The excitement and sense that things are about to change massively takes off within the town. There's a whole host of religious changes that start to happen. Münster develops a big rainbow flag, which they keep in the main church of St. Mary's, and the church is still there. It is a stunning church. If ever you're in that area, you must go and see St. Mary's Church, and the outside of it is just fabulous. And he had the best house in town, right next to St. Mary's Church, which used to belong to the German Knights, the Teutonic Knights, who are a monastic military order, very much hated. By this point, they've been kicked out by the Mühlhausen people, and Münster has got that house. And you can still get in today, and you can see the kitchen that they had. Really amazing. So things are getting very heated, and the ideas of the Peasants' War are starting to come through Thuringia, Franconia, and this is the point at which Münster starts creating a group of people who follow him. The bands of peasants are now bands of armed peasants, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they go on a sort of preaching tour through the Eichsfeld, which is now, interestingly, a very Catholic area and remained Catholic right through the communist period. Very, very interesting area. So off they set in that direction, and then they come back, and then they move to Frankenhausen, which is where in this region there was a big battle. And Münzer and his followers, 200, 300, turn up. But by this point, it's not just Münzer at all, and it never was just Münzer. There's a huge army that's assembled there of about 6,000 men around Frankenhausen, and then they move up onto the heights, which is where the battle is. But that's only just one battle. There's, I don't know, it depends on how you count them, but there's probably about 20 major battles in the course of the Peasants' War, including in Alsace. So it's not just Germany, it's not just Germany, Austria and Italy, it's France as well.
And why are the peasants ultimately defeated?
Well, there are many reasons why they're defeated. One of them clearly is that they're not militarily trained. It's not that they're not armed, because they weren't just setting out with agricultural implements, which is what people used to think. They were able, when they plundered convents and monasteries and castles, to get quite a lot of weapons. And they also had a lot of money because of what they were able to melt down or sell from the convents and monasteries, and that also bought them arms. But the problem was that in Italy, there was war going on where German mercenaries were being used, and with the Battle of Pavia, that came to an end, and those mercenaries were back on the market. And the lords in early 1525 had real trouble getting soldiers. So when they did, it was very hard always to get them to fight, because often they would mutiny and refuse to fight their own people. But by May 1525, after some defeats in April, where they managed to defeat the peasants very decisively, then from really mid-May onwards, the tide turns completely and the peasants start being defeated. And one of the reasons is that they follow a tactic which had been used in the Hussite wars, which is that they get all the wagons on which the plunder is, and then they put them in a circle, a sort of a wagon castle, as they call it, and then they defend that. But the trouble is, once the first shot is fired, that tends to panic people, and they don't have the military experience to form a solid formation. And that's the only way, really, that you can deal with cavalry. Once you flee and you're facing cavalry, that's when you get mass casualties, because knights on horseback can just pick you off and just kill person after person. And what often happens is that the peasants get caught in the escape route back into the town. And those marks in the landscape still exist. So if you go to Feddersheim, there's a thing called the Blood Hollow, and it's between the vineyards. It's sort of like a sort of big, what would be the English word? It's sort of like a big cutting. So you've got the high vineyards, and you don't, when you're up in the vineyards, you can't see this big hollow that goes right into the town. But of course, people got trapped in there, and then with horses coming at them, there's not much they can do. What the lords understand is how to use military force to cause people to panic and to make them flee. So they do that in different ways. It's a kind of early modern kettling. I don't know whether you've ever experienced kettling, but that's what it is. And in one case, in Leipheim in April, they used it so that the peasants all were basically pushed into the Danube River. So 300 of them drowned in the river, and many more were killed on the way back into town. And in Frankenhausen itself, there's a thing called the Blood Gully, and again, that's the route that peasants were forced back down, and with cavalry coming at them, there was just nothing they could do.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, I guess this is the point in history, right, where a mass of pikemen can break a cavalry charge, but it requires discipline and organization at a level. I mean, it has to be every single one of those pikemen has to be in this like phalanx formation, standing perfectly. And this is not what the peasants have.
No.
So cavalry is still
No.
the trump card on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's starting to change, but you need real training to do that to bring that about. And it's not that the peasants didn't have anyone who understood military tactics, because many of those who fought with the peasants were people who had been mercenaries and who had that military experience. But you can't train thousands of peasants to do that
in a spring.
No.
Overnight.
No.
Yeah. Okay. And then another reading of this, of course, as you mentioned, is the soldiers won't turn on their own people. I mean, when we talk about kettling and we think about modern events, a lot of times regimes fall when the protesters come out and the military or the police refuse to shoot. But you're telling me in this case, there were moments like that, but ultimately they had the men at their command who would use violence, and that was the final difference maker.
Yes, I think so. Interestingly, in Alsace, which saw some of the most horrific atrocities and a lot of rapes of women, there we know that the soldiers didn't speak German. So part of the dynamic is that they don't recognise the people they're fighting as fellow human beings. They see them as Lutheran heretics, and they see them as not fully human. And I think that's part of the reason why the violence there is so excessive, so dreadful, and involves so much rape of women. Everybody comments on that.
Yeah, and
time.
Since you've mentioned that, I guess we should also mention, I mean, I'm very much on the side of the revolutionaries, but the women in the convents and often the wives and daughters of the lords in the castles are often raped or murdered, if I understand that correctly.
I don't think they are.
Okay, that was my misreading of your book.
I think they certainly threaten them.
They're threatened.
And they certainly say all kinds of things that mock them, and that mock them sexually. There's a lot of sexual mockery, like saying, come here, you old dog, we'll pull out your beard. That's what one of them says to someone to a lord in his castle, and then they say, and we'll rape your daughters. But it's a threat.
Uh-huh.
And as far as we know, it's not said in the sources that they carry it out, nor are they punished for that later. Whereas in Alsace,
right,
everybody says it's the armies of the lords who are taking women out into the fields and raping them, so that the women just don't know what to do, as one of the sources says.
I mean, good then. I mean, score one again for the revolutionaries.
I'm sure they weren't very nice, but a lot of the violence is verbal violence. Mm-hmm. And of course, verbal violence in this period is taken very seriously.
Yes.
You can be taken to court for it, but it doesn't seem to be mass rapes as far as I can see.
That's very interesting to hear. Yeah, in terms of the verbal violence, I mean, I just took my students to Romeo and Juliet, and verbal threats are taken it can be a capital offense or a killing offense to offer up this level of insult, and of course, coming from peasants to lords, that just must.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it comes as peasants are insisting on equality. So one of the things they say is, "Get off your horse." And horses make that social difference so clear, because someone on a horse is so much higher and has so much more force available to them to use against you.
Yeah, this as we move towards the end, I mean, one thing I wanted to say that really struck me is early in your book you mentioned that the relationship between, labor and the land and someone's ability to eat and shelter and have clothing was just obvious. And this is one of the biggest challenges in the 21st century to, creating a revolutionary movement. When you go to the grocery store and there's milk and there's tomatoes, and then you can buy a t-shirt for 12 pounds, and the the suffering and exploitation that created the tomato and the milk and the T-shirt of the workers who created it, the poison that went into the land, the forms of pesticides and herbicides to grow the tomato, the suffering of the cows. We don't see that. That's one of the great projects of revolutionaries, which is why you have these videos depicting the horrors of, the migrant workers who pick the tomatoes, or the cows, the lives they live, making people see the connection between exploitation and, bounty is very difficult. These peasants didn't have any question about who was being exploited and where the food came from. They knew.
Yes, they absolutely knew. And what's interesting is that a lot of the Reformation theologians and even rulers and political figures, they can see that it isn't just. And many of them say that the peasants have a justice on their side, that they are right to complain and that they have been treated badly. And it reaches such a pitch that Luther's own ruler, Frederick the Wise, who is on his deathbed at the point of the Peasants' War, says, well, if it's God's will that the peasants should win, what can we do?
Wow.
We just have to accept it. And he did not want to take the field against the peasants. And of course, if you kill your own peasants, you're destroying your own labour force. And in cases where it's serfdom, physical bodily serfdom, you're destroying your own possession.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well let's get into the historiography a little bit to finish. I mean, anyone who listens to this podcast knows that I'm not a big fan of Marx, and there's this great this podcaster I like, Mike Duncan, has a great line about how Marx doesn't seem to be sure that you can have a revolution based on peasants. He claims that you need the proletariat, and Mike Duncan says, Zapato and Pancho Villa knew you could have a revolution based on peasants. But how is it that even Marx, how is it that we have, it's the year 2025, and the idea that peasants can be revolutionaries is still almost, not to be spoken of? Why have peasants been left out of the historical narrative? Is it just that history is the story of the great and the good? I'll put that in quotation marks, the great and the good. Why is it so hard to recover peasants from history?
Well, that was what made me really annoyed. I felt that so much of the historiography talks about famous individuals. It talks about Thomas Müntzer, it talks about this preacher or that preacher, it talks about what's going on in the town, and it goes on endlessly about Martin Luther and his attitudes to the Peasants' War. And I thought, I want the peasants to be part of this. And Marx and Engels were writing at a time when they couldn't see that peasants could be revolutionary, and they felt that they couldn't be because they owned farms and property, and that would always make them conservative. And actually, it's really interesting. The main critical things I've got from people are from old Marxists who say this is not right. And there's still a resistance to seeing. Well, it seems to me that peasants are constantly thinking about the future, working out what strategies they should adopt. I think peasants are interested in ideas, and they have to be able to change, because if one crop doesn't work, they've got to grow something else. And they've got to seize the possibilities that the market offered. And we know that in this period, well, there were villages and small towns, really 20 kilometres away, 30 kilometres away from everyone. You could always take your stuff to market, and peasants were always doing that. In particular, peasant women, because they're the ones who sell the poultry, the eggs, the milk and the cheese. So women really need to be part of how we think about the Reformation, and we know that Reformation ideas were spreading in town, so of course peasants were hearing about them, were interested in them, and wanted to apply them to their own situation. And I think that people can change during revolutionary periods very fast. And then I think that they change during the course of a revolution. And I think you can see that in the lives of many people who become much more radical during the course of the Peasants' War. So someone like Sebastian Lotzer, that guy back in Memmingen who was just a furrier, he starts out a sort of conservative Lutheran, straight down the line, in favour of the Bible, writing pamphlets that celebrate Luther and the new ideas. But then, when he starts putting the peasants' complaints together, he becomes much more radical. And in a short space of time, he says to the peasant army that he's willing to be their notary and to do it for free. And that's what he does. He acts as their unpaid notary during the course of the Peasants' War, taking a huge personal risk. And he's not the only one. All the peasants are taking a huge personal risk. And so are many preachers who go along with the peasants. So I think that people can change during the course of a revolution because of what they experience. Because when they see how the might of the lords is used against them, they then become more radical in what they're demanding. And they also suddenly see themselves as part of a collective, part of a community that isn't just their local community, but a community that can stretch for hundreds of kilometres. And they start having new political ideas that go along with those bigger horizons.
Yeah, I think that makes complete sense in terms of the way that peasants become radicalized. My final question is, how do we rewrite our history books so that moments like this or Wat Tyler's rebellion aren't just these, few peaks? I mean, I love Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell trilogy. Whether it's good history, I'm doubtful, but it's a brilliant work of art. But relatively late in the third book, all of a sudden the peasants are revolting, and there's a few pages where they're like, this might be it for Henry VIII's reign, and then a few pages later it's like, nope, it's okay, we put them down. And I just thought, this is shocking that this book that observes minutely what so many courtiers are thinking, minutely, in part because she had the letters and the diaries of some of these courtiers. The peasants almost bring Henry VIII down, and that's, even in a novel about it, it's barely touched upon. You've written a book, that's a good start.
Well, I've always been fascinated by the Peasants' War, and for me as a historian, it's moments of revolution that are really, really important to understand. And I think that really my generation was writing history very much in terms of the growth of the state. Well, that's important and good to know about, but I think that revolts and moments of rupture are really important to understand, and I think we haven't paid them enough attention. And I think, too, that the way that an event like the Peasants' War lives on is really important to think about, too. It's very hard to get at, because after the Peasants' War, it was dangerous to talk about it. It was dangerous, certainly, to print anything in favour of it. Nobody did that. We don't have an account of the Peasants' War from the peasants themselves. There was one, but the guy who wrote it took it to Nuremberg and got it printed, but the Nuremberg authorities got wind of it and they destroyed it completely. If we only had that history of the Peasants' War, how wonderful that would be. Instead, what we have is just hints from criminal interrogations later. And I've gotten interested in secret monuments to the war, or if you like, the way in which something that is unspeakable, because it's too dangerous to talk about, comes out in other ways. So I've been interested in monuments. I've been interested in why it is that something like the Blood Hollow has not been forgotten. There it is in the landscape, everyone knows about it. The same also with the Blood Gully at Frankenhausen, everyone knows about it. And I think sometimes it's the land itself which retains that memory and retains the possibility, the ideas that inspire a revolution, because people live in that space, they go to that space and they remember. But then there are other things too, like an amazing tower in Heilbronn, completed in 1529, 4 years after the Peasants' War, when the town was involved in a case to prove that it had never joined with the peasants, which it jolly well had. That tower is full of anti-clerical sculptures. It was begun in 1507, but I think if one looks at that tower, and if you go up it, which is absolutely terrifying because it has an external spiral staircase, and you get to the top, and there's a moment where you have to cross to the spire, and there's just two little metal bars and nothing on either side, and you have to cross into the space which is the patricians' dancing hall, so it's called. It's not, of course. It's just an amazing octagonal room. It's right below you is the town council, and it was a patrician town council. So that spire and the step into the patrician dancing hall couldn't be a better representation of the political dream and the political risk that's involved in the Peasants' War.
All right.
And it's things like that
Yes.
that I just find fascinating, and that make you realise that those ideas are not forgotten. After the Second World War, when Heilbronn had been bombed, they could have just demolished that tower and put what was left of the sculptures into a museum. But what did they do? They jolly well rebuilt it.
Okay, this has been wonderful. What else do we need to say? And this is your chance to have the last word. Anything else I didn't ask about or we didn't cover? It's a big book. I know we didn't get to all of it.
No, I don't think so. I suppose I would say that as a historian, having the privilege to go to Germany, which I've been doing just about every week a different place will be celebrating this, and I have had the most amazing experiences, met the most extraordinary people, and seen just the work of artists, dramatists. I even got involved in a Peasants' War opera, which was put on by a bunch of amateurs, and I got to know all the cast, and I got to sing on stage, and things like that make you realise that history is not dead, and that the arguments over what the Peasants' War means and how we should understand it are really alive today. And for me, as a historian, I think that what history can do is it can help us to listen to one another. So I hope very much that West Germans will be able to listen to East Germans and their experience of life under communism, life under dictatorship, that the two sides will be able to learn from one another through understanding the Peasants' War differently. And that's going to involve a reassessment of who Thomas Müntzer was and how important he was or wasn't.
All right, one more time. The book is Summer of Fire and Blood, The German Peasants' War. Lyndal, thank you so much.
Thank you.